In the spring of 1933, if you were an American and you owned gold, you had a choice to make. Not a financial choice, a legal one. Hand it over or go to prison. It didn't matter how you'd earned it, how long you'd held it, or how carefully you'd protected it. Executive Order 6102 gave the United States government the authority to seize private gold holdings, almost overnight, from ordinary citizens and the wealthiest families alike. Vaults were opened, safes were emptied, fortunes that had felt permanent, untouchable, generational, were converted into paper at a price the government itself decided. This wasn't a foreign invasion. It wasn't a market crash. It was a signature, and that's the detail worth sitting with. The people who lost the most that year weren't outmaneuvered by a smarter investor or a rival empire. They were reminded, in the plainest way possible, that their wealth had only ever existed by permission. Permission granted by a system they didn't control and could revoke at will. Which raises the question this entire documentary is built around. If money can be erased by a single decision from someone who has none of it themselves, then what exactly were the wealthy holding onto in the first place? Here's the uncomfortable truth most people never sit with. Money was never a possession. It's a claim. A $100 bill isn't wealth in itself. It's a promise. A promise that a stranger, in a country you've never visited, will accept it in exchange for something real. Food, shelter, labor, land. That promise only holds because an entire architecture stands behind it. Governments that enforce contracts, courts that punish fraud, central banks that manage its value, and armies that protect the borders where that value is allowed to mean anything at all. Take away that architecture, and the money doesn't lose some of its worth. It loses all of it. A drawer full of Confederate dollars after 1865 wasn't a smaller fortune. It was paper. This is the part that gets lost in how we talk about wealth. We treat money like it's something you own outright, the way you own a house or a piece of land. But land doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. Money does. Every dollar, every gold bar, every digital balance in a bank account is really just a lease. One that depends entirely on the goodwill of the systems enforcing it. Which means the people who built real, lasting power in history were rarely the ones who accumulated the most of it. They were the ones who controlled the terms of the lease. History keeps proving this same lesson in almost the same way to almost everyone who forgets it. Rome's wealthiest citizens once measured their fortunes in silver denarii, a currency trusted across 3 continents. But as emperors quietly reduced the silver content to fund wars and pay soldiers, the coin looked the same, weighed the same, spent the same, for a while. Then prices began to climb and kept climbing until a fortune that had taken generations to build could no longer buy what it once did. No one stole that wealth. It simply stopped meaning what it used to mean because the people controlling the currency changed the rules without changing the appearance. Germany's merchants and industrialists learned the same lesson faster and more brutally in 1923. Life savings that had funded comfortable futures became, within months, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. Photographs from the period show children stacking banknotes like building blocks. Not because the money had lost some value, but because the system behind it had lost its credibility entirely. And centuries earlier, some of Europe's wealthiest banking families discovered a quieter version of the same trap. They financed kings, funded wars, held debts that entire monarchies depended on. And still, when a ruler needed to make a debt disappear, a decree was often all it took. The fortune was real. The protection around it was not. The pattern is always the same. The money survives only as long as the system behind it chooses to honor it. And that system has never been controlled by the people holding the money. So if money isn't the source of power, what is? It's the architecture that decides whether money means anything at all. For systems, working together quietly determine the value of every fortune on earth. The first is the state's monopoly on enforcement. The simple fact that only governments can legally compel someone to honor a contract, repay a debt, or respect a property line. Without that enforcement, ownership is just an opinion. The second is the central bank, the institution that decides how much currency exists, what it costs to borrow, and how fast that currency will lose its meaning. A single interest rate decision can reshape more fortunes in an afternoon than most wars manage in a decade. The third is the legal system, the quiet machinery of courts, regulators, and legislators who define what counts as legitimate wealth versus what counts as seizable, taxable, or illegal. Legitimacy isn't declared by the wealthy. It's granted to them. And the fourth is military and geopolitical protection. The reason a fortune held in a stable, powerful nation behaves completely differently from the same fortune held somewhere that nation could destabilize tomorrow. None of these four systems require personal wealth to control. A treasury official, a central banker, a judge, a general, none of them may hold a fraction of the fortune they can influence. And yet, each one sits closer to the real architecture of power than almost any billionaire ever will. This is the inversion most people miss. Wealth is often the most visible form of power and the least foundational. The architecture behind it is invisible, unglamorous, and almost never discussed, which is exactly why it lasts. History is full of people who never appeared on a rich list and still shaped the fate of everyone who did. Central bankers are the clearest example. A Federal Reserve chair earns a government salary, modest by the standards of the industries they oversee. And yet, a single word from that office, a signal about interest rates, a shift in monetary policy, can add or erase trillions in wealth across global markets within hours. No fortune of their own, total influence over everyone else's. Regulators tell the same story. The officials who decide whether a merger is approved, whether a monopoly is broken up, whether an industry is allowed to operate the way it always has, they don't need capital to exercise that power. They need position. Standard Oil didn't fall because a competitor outspent it. It fell because a government decided its size had become a threat to the system itself and had the legal authority to dismantle it. Even monarchs and rulers throughout history often held less personal wealth than the merchants and bankers who served them, and still commanded absolute authority, because legitimacy, not liquidity, was the currency that actually mattered. A king didn't need to out-earn his bankers. He needed the power to declare, at any moment, what their earnings were worth. This is the through line connecting all of them: legitimacy, access, and the authority to set the rules. Those are transferable in ways money never fully is. You can lose a fortune in an afternoon. Position within the architecture of power is far harder to seize and far more durable once secured, which is exactly why the truly powerful, throughout history, have quietly prioritized one over the other. It's tempting to think this belongs to history, that modern wealth, especially at the scale of today's billionaires, has finally escaped the old vulnerability. It hasn't. It's just wearing a new disguise. Sanctions are the clearest proof. In the past few years, some of the wealthiest individuals on Earth have watched yachts seized, properties frozen, and access to entire banking systems cut off. Not because their fortunes were illegitimate, but because a government decided, almost overnight, that their money would no longer be allowed to move. The wealth still existed on paper. It simply stopped functioning. Even the digital frontier hasn't changed the underlying rule. Cryptocurrency was built, in part, on the promise of escaping exactly this kind of dependency, money that no government could freeze or devalue. And yet exchanges have been shut down by regulators. Wallets have been seized through court orders, and entire platforms have been rendered worthless by a change in legal status. The architecture evolved. The vulnerability didn't. Even influence itself now runs through systems the wealthy don't fully own. A platform can deplatform. A payment processor can decline to process. A regulator can freeze an account before a single law has technically been broken. The billionaire depends on infrastructure, banking, legal, digital, political, controlled by people who will never appear on the same rich list. The lesson hasn't changed in 100 years. It's only become harder to see because the architecture now looks like technology instead of decree. So return to that vault in 1933 one more time. The people who lost their gold that year weren't naive. They weren't careless. They had done everything the system had told them to do: accumulate, protect, hold. What they hadn't done was understand what they were actually holding. Not power. A claim on power, issued by an authority that could revoke it whenever the terms changed. That's the pattern underneath every empire, every currency collapse, every modern seizure. Money has always been the shadow power cast, visible, tempting, easy to measure. But the object casting that shadow has always been something else. Legitimacy, enforcement, access to the systems that decide what money is even allowed to mean. The people who understood this, the central bankers, the regulators, the quiet architects of law and legitimacy, rarely needed vast fortunes of their own. They needed something rarer, the authority to set the terms everyone else's fortune depended on, which leaves the real question, not how much you have, but who controls whether it still means anything tomorrow. Money has always promised safety. It has never delivered it, not because money fails, but because it was never designed to stand alone. It exists inside systems built by people who don't need it in the same quantities, enforced by rules that can change without asking permission. The truly powerful have always understood this distinction, even when they didn't say it aloud. They didn't chase the largest fortune. They positioned themselves closer to the architecture that decides what every fortune is worth. The names change. The gold gets counted differently in every century, but the architecture behind it, quiet, procedural, almost invisible, remains exactly where it has always been.